After years of desolate isolation, when Silas had lost everything he held dear, three enigmatic women presented him with an opportunity for a new life. He could not have foreseen that their beauty and nurturing care were merely components of a cruel scheme for vengeance, rooted in a past to which he had no connection. Yet, as his ranch was on the brink of being lost forever, fate, in the form of a single man, offered him a second chance. Read on to uncover the shocking resolution of this drama and how, in the end, a different kind of justice prevailed. This narrative culminates in a profound insight that will impart wisdom and provoke deep thought. Be sure to stay with the story to the very end, as its plot will leave you utterly astounded. The Wild Horse Ranch was the very embodiment of solitude. In 1883, within the boundless plains of Arizona, it was the domain of Silas McKenna, a sturdy and reticent man in his early 40s. His face, deeply ashed with lines from a life spent under the sun and wine, bore the unmistakable mark of prolonged, arduous labor and, more noticeably, a profound sadness. Silas had been a widower for a decade, having lost his wife and newborn son during an epidemic. Since that time, his existence had settled into a relentless cycle: sunrise, work, sunset, whiskey, and silence. He was the sole human inhabitant of the ranch, save for the fleeting presence of a dozen cowboys who would come and go, moving the cattle. One sweltering afternoon, a dusty stagecoach made an unexpected stop at the ranch. Its presence was highly unusual, as the main road lay many miles away. From within, three women emerged, causing Silas to freeze in his tracks, leaning against the corral fence. It was a sight so surprising it bordered on disbelief. In this desolate wilderness, where even a tumbleweed seemed a rarity, three perfect paragons of feminine grace stood before him. The first was Eleanor. Her auburn hair, braided into tight plaits, glistened in the sunlight, and her emerald eyes seemed to mirror the vibrant green of every plant that had ever existed on the earth. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant travel gown that accentuated her tall, proud posture. She regarded Silas with a confident, knowing smile. Following her was Mina. Her hair was the color of ripe wheat, and her eyes were a deep, fathomless blue, like the summer sky over the prairies. She was physically smaller than Eleanor, but her gentle, delicate demeanor concealed an undeniable inner strength. She didn't smile, but merely lowered her gaze slightly, as if with shyness, a quality that only added to her charm. The third was Corinne. Her hair was the color of a raven's wing, pulled into a high bun, and her eyes were the deep shade of dark coffee. Her facial features were sharp and resolute, and she carried herself with an air of unconcealed authority. She wore a severe black.
I ask you to like and subscribe to the channel, so you will help me in motivation to make such great stories for you, and I will see that you like them. Enjoy watching, everyone.
Dress that served only to highlight her pallor. As all three women stepped down from the stagecoach, Silas felt as though his parched prairies had suddenly been transported to the foot of a snow-capped mountain. The air felt different, more saturated, more moist. The man, accustomed to the straightforward company of cowboys, was rendered speechless. Eleanor stepped forward and spoke first, her voice as melodious and pure as spring water. "Are you Silas McKenna?" she inquired. Silas could only nod, unable to form a word. "We have been searching for you. We are sisters, and we have come to offer you something you may never have dared to dream of. We will be your wives." The sheer shock of this declaration was so profound that Silas nearly dropped his mug. The women, in whose eyes he saw not only beauty but something utterly ineffable, stood before him like emissaries from another world. This initial moment of astonishment was only the beginning. It was swiftly followed by a wave of admiration. Three sisters, three distinct personalities, three promises. Eleanor, with her open smile and direct gaze, immediately assumed the role of the household matriarch. She possessed an unparalleled talent for managing affairs, and her presence in the home breathed new life into it. She brought seeds Silas had never seen before, and within days, a small patch of land he had long considered barren began to flourish. Eleanor didn't just command, she worked, and afraid to get her hands dirty, and her unwavering determination was nothing short of admirable. Mina proved to be her complete opposite. She was quiet and deeply caring. Her hands, which appeared so delicate and fragile, could prepare a meal that would make any cowboy forget his rugged ways. She sewed, mended clothes, and sang ancient ballads, her voice, soft as silk, filling the house with comfort and warmth. Mina had a way of connecting with even the most sullen workers, who now gravitated toward her for counsel or just a kind word. She was the very embodiment of the hearth that the ranch had lacked for so long. Corinne, however, remained a mystery. She spoke little, preferring to observe. Her gaze, sharp and penetrating, seemed to see not only what was on the surface, but what was hidden in the depths of a person's soul. Corinne understood horses better than any of the cowboys, and her calm confidence commanded respect. She could suit the most skittish stallion in a matter of minutes, a skill that inspired not only admiration, but a subtle undercurrent of fear. Silas sensed that something more than just equestrian knowledge lay beneath her cold demeanor. She seemed to see right through him, a thought that was deeply unsettling. For the first time in a decade, Silas felt himself to be more than just the owner of a ranch. He was the head of a family. Life at Wild Horse was utterly transformed. The ranch began to prosper. The cattle grew plump, the harvest was bountiful, and the house was perpetually filled with the scent of fresh-baked goods. The cowboys, who had once seen him as nothing more than a stern boss, now regarded him with a new respect as a man capable of attracting such remarkable women. Silas found himself enveloped in attention and care. Eleanor discussed future plans with him. Mina quietly left his favorite whiskey on the table, and Corinne was simply there, like a silent shadow, yet her presence felt like a powerful support. Each of them brought into his life what he had been missing for so long, and he gradually began to surrender to this feeling of admiration. His loneliness receded, replaced by a sense of wholeness and joy. But occasionally, in the quiet of the night, he noticed that these three women, so different during the day, would gather together for long, hushed conversations. Their words were barely audible, and he could never make out what they were discussing. In those moments, a faint fear would creep over him once more. It was not a fear of the women themselves. It was the dread that this was all too perfect to be true, that this idyllic sanctuary would demand an exorbitant price. And while his mind urged him to savor the moment, his instinct warned him that this peace was merely the calm before the storm. This storm arrived in the form of a stranger who rode up to the ranch one evening. He was an old man, his horse's saddle well-worn, and his gaze was heavy and weary. He asked for water and inquired where he might find Silas McKenna. Silas, the ranch owner replied. The stranger, who introduced himself as Elias, stared at him intently. Are you the same Silas who lost his wife and son? He asked. Yes, Silas replied, feeling his heart tighten. Elias glanced around the ranch as if searching for something, and then his eyes landed on Eleanor, Mina, and Corinne, who had come out onto the porch. His eyes widened in horror. He covered his mouth with his hand, as if to stifle a scream. What is it, old man? Silas asked, feeling a cold dread seep into his soul. Elias, without answering, sprang into his saddle and, lashing his horse, galloped off into the sunset as if pursued by specters. Silas turned to the women. Their faces were pale, their smiles vanished. Eleanor, who was always so composed, now looked terrified. Corinne glared at the disappearing figure with overt hostility. Only Mina, with her perpetually serene face, walked up to Silas and took his hand. Don't pay him any mind, she said softly. The old man must have just been frightened. But Silas knew this was not the case. He had seen the fear in Elias's eyes, and it wasn't just fear, it was pure horror. And it was connected to him, to his past, and to these three women. This was the first fissure in his perfect life, the initial sign that his admiration had been a delusion. That something far darker and more terrifying was hidden beneath the surface. Following the mysterious departure of Elias, a tense silence settled over the ranch. Eleanor, always so open and cheerful, began to avoid Silas, spending more time in the stables with Corinne. Mina, by contrast, became even more affectionate than before, but in her eyes, when she looked at Silas, a new emotion was evident, a tenderness tinged with a subtle, hidden sorrow. The faint fear that had previously been a mere shadow now became palpable, a heavy presence in the air. Silas began to notice other unsettling oddities. One evening, while checking the fence line, he saw Eleanor speaking to an unknown figure at the creek. The man was shrouded in a long, dark cloak, his face obscured by shadow. Silas called out to her, but she turned away hastily, gave a quick nod to the stranger, and he disappeared into the brush. When she approached, Silas asked who it was. Just an old peddler, darling, she replied with a strange smile, but her eyes, usually so candid, now seemed vacant. Events began to accelerate. Within a week, several cows went missing, the very ones that appeared to be the healthiest. That same night, Silas heard strange noises from the barn. He went to investigate, but the door was locked. He saw a light flickering through the cracks and heard voices. They were Mina's and Corinne's. He listened closely. "He won't notice a thing," Corinne's voice said, dripping with arrogance. "He's far too trusting," mine added, her voice lacking any trace of her usual tenderness. Silas retreated into the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. What were they doing? And what were they hiding? The feeling of fear intensified, morphing into a nagging, oppressive anxiety. The next morning, as Silas was cleaning the stalls, his attention was drawn to an old, cracked saddle lying in a corner. It had belonged to his late father. He picked it up, noticing it felt unusually light. He ran his hand along the inside of the saddle and felt something hidden within. Tearing open the lining, he discovered a small bundle wrapped in yellowed parchment. Inside was a photograph. It showed 3 young girls in wrinkled, old dresses. Below the photo, written in pencil, was a single word: witches. He turned the photograph over, and on the back, a drawing of a tree was etched, each branch marked with a name: Eleanor, Mina, Corinne. Underneath the tree, a chilling message was scrawled: "Dead souls, beware." His hand began to tremble. His admiration for these women, who had brought light into his life, was now supplanted by a deep, bone-chilling terror. Elias the stranger, his cryptic words, their clandestine meetings, the strange sounds from the barnet all began to coalesce into a single, horrifying picture. Eleanor, Mina, and Corinne seemed to know he had discovered something. Their gazes, which had always been so fixated on him, now seemed wary. At dinner, Eleanor placed a large pie on the table. "Eat, darling," she said, her smile forced. "You look tired." Silas cautiously refused. He felt an invisible knot tightening in his throat. He looked at Mina, whose gentle features now seemed alien. He looked at Corinne, who was staring at him, as if reading his thoughts. He rose from his chair and headed for the door. "Where are you going?" Eleanor asked, her voice turning sharp. "I need to check on the horses," he lied. As soon as he was outside, he heard them talking loudly, no longer discreetly, as if they no longer cared about his presence. "Hell, do it anyway. One way or another," Corinne's voice said, full of malicious glee. "We have to hurry," Eleanor added. Silas immediately headed toward the canyon, where he typically drove some of his cattle. Thoughts raced through his mind. What did they mean? What were they planning to do? He felt the world he had so carefully built for so long collapsing around him. At that moment, he saw a small group of men arriving at the canyon. They didn't look like cowboys. Their wagon was laden with tools, and Silas hid behind a rock to listen. The men spoke quietly, but Silas was able to hear them. "Everything will be ready soon. Once McKenna makes his move, his cattle will be ours. And his ranch, too. They paid us to get rid of him." The stranger's words hit him like a physical blow. Everything in Silas' mind clicked into place. This wasn't just a shock, it was the devastating realization that these women, whom he had welcomed into his life, were, in fact, his enemies. They had not brought him happiness, they had brought destruction. Their objective was not to become his wives, but to seize everything he possessed. They were in league with these bandits. He ran back to the ranch, his heart pounding in his chest. He had to gather his weapons, warn the cowboys. He burst into the house, but it was empty. On the table lay an envelope. Inside was a letter from Eleanor, written in the same precise handwriting as on the back of the photograph. "Silas," the letter began, "we are not who we pretend to be. We are the heiresses of the land your family stole from ours. Your father, Arthur Thorne, and his father, killed our family to take this canyon. He thought we perished in the fire, but we survived, 3 sisters who have been nurturing one plan ever since to return and reclaim what is ours." Silas lowered the letter, his hands shaking. The shock was too much to process. Everything he believed to be true was a lie. All the warmth, care, and beauty were merely an intricately woven web of deceit. The 3 women, who were supposed to become his family, were nothing more than vengeful phantoms from the past. The brief period of happiness he had experienced had turned into an absolute nightmare. The light in his life was extinguished. He stood in the middle of a house that had been so full of their presence, but now felt hollow and cold. The emotion of shock consumed him, displacing all other feelings. He had fallen in love with his enemies. He had opened his home and his heart to them, and they had simply used him. This wasn't merely betrayal, it was a cruel, merciless demolition of his life, his ranch, his home, his hopes. Everything was in peril. And what had they done to Elias? What would they do to him? Thoughts raced uncontrollably through his mind, offering no peace, and his soul, at last, felt the inevitable sadness that had been waiting for him all along. Eleanor's letter fluttered to the wooden floor like a final verdict. Silas stood in the middle of his house, and the walls, which had been filled with warmth just yesterday, now felt cold and alien. They had stolen not just cattle, not just a ranch, they had stolen his hope. The initial shock gradually gave way to a deep, all-consuming sadness. He had been so blind, so gullible. Memories of his deceased wife and son surfaced in his mind. He recalled how difficult it was for him after their loss, how he tried to heal the wounds, and then, when these three women appeared, he believed heaven had answered his prayers. He had trusted them, opened his heart to them, and now it was torn to shreds. He had been deceived, humiliated, and most devastatingly, he couldn't believe that the people he had trusted had turned out to be his most bitter adversaries. He heard the horses neigh. Rushing outside, he saw that his cowboys, as if by some unspoken command, were gathering in a group. One of them, Old Cal, approached him with a bewildered expression. "Boss, is something wrong?" he asked. "The ladies told us we could rest while they took care of some business." Silas slowly raised his eyes, which were filled with sorrow, to his men. "Go back to your homes," he said quietly. "There is nothing left for us here." Cal and the other cowboys, not understanding what was happening, simply obeyed. Silas stood alone, watching his men depart like shadows. His home, his ranch, his life, all of it was crumbling before his eyes. At that moment, Eleanor appeared from around the corner of the barn. Her face, usually so flawless, now looked hard and ruthless. "You read the letter," she said, her tone a statement, not a question. "You shouldn't have. Why did you do this?" Silas asked, his voice trembling. Why did you come into my home? My life only to destroy everything?" "Your father, Arthur Thorne, killed our family," she replied. "He came when we were just children and burned down our home. He took this land that your family calls Wild Horse, but for us, it is a cursed place. He thought we had died in the fire, but we survived, 3 sisters who have been planning ever since to return and reclaim what is ours. But I didn't know about it," Silas responded, feeling his heart clench with pain. Eleanor shook her head. "It doesn't matter. You are his blood, and we are revenge." She gestured toward an approaching wagon. These were the same men he had seen in the canyon. "They will take everything you have, and then, when you are left with nothing, we will return to our land, which will finally be ours again. This is our justice." Eleanor's words were a brutal revelation. Silas finally understood. Their love, their care, their smiles, all of it had been part of a meticulously orchestrated plan to blind him, to strip him of his vigilance. He was a pawn in their game, and his sadness swelled into a feeling of utter hopelessness. He had neither the strength nor the weapon to oppose them. He was completely alone. At that moment, Mina emerged from behind the barn. Her eyes, usually so gentle, were filled with tears. "I didn't want this," she whispered, looking at Silas. "I didn't want it to end this way." Eleanor turned to her with rage. "What are you doing? Forget him. We've waited for this for so many years." Corinne also appeared from behind the barn. In her hand, she held an old colt that belonged to Silas. She extended it to him. "Take it," she said quietly. "I knew you weren't like them. Not like your father. I cannot let it end like this." Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. "Corinne, what are you doing?" she screamed, lunging at her sister. Corinne pushed her away, but Eleanor managed to snatch the colt from her hand. At the same time, the men from the wagon dismounted, their rifles aimed at Silas. "He's ours," one of them said. "Well, take care of him." Silas, trapped between the 3 sisters and the bandits, realized he was in a snare. He was a victim. His entire life, his dreams, his ambitions, all of it had been reduced to nothing. He had been so close to happiness, to a new life, but this illusion had shattered. This sadness was heavier than a decade of loneliness. Eleanor aimed the colt at Silas. Her hand trembled. "Get off my land," she hissed, "or I will do what I should have done long ago." But then Mine intervened. She lunged forward, shielding Silas with her body. "No," she cried. "Don't. He's not to blame." Eleanor, losing control of her emotions, fired, but the bullet missed Silas, flying past and leaving only a faint scratch on his cheek. In that moment of Eleanor's confusion, Silas instinctively grabbed a heavy stone from the ground and hurled it at her. She fell, dropping the pistol. Seeing the situation unraveling, the bandits rushed toward Silas, but at that moment, 2 cowboys burst from behind the barn. Old Cal, who hadn't left, and his partner Jed. They quickly overpowered the bandits, subduing and tying them up. They had not left. They had been watching the house all along, sensing that something was terribly wrong. Silence returned to the ranch, The bound bandits lay on the ground. Eleanor, stunned by the blow, was struggling to get up. Mina and Corinne, standing beside Silas, looked at him with different expressions. Mina, with relief, and Corinne, with admiration. Silas looked at each of them, and now that the illusion had crumbled, he saw them not as merely beautiful women. He saw sisters who had been broken by revenge, whose fate had intertwined with his a man who was innocent. He saw their pain, their disappointment, their profound sadness. "I will not seek revenge," he said quietly. "This ranch belongs to your family. It always has. I am giving it to you. Go and start your lives anew." Their eyes filled with sorrow. They had not anticipated this outcome. They had expected a battle, hatred, but not compassion. They had come to destroy his life, and he had given them his most precious possession. This was not a triumph or a victory. It was a catharsis, a liberation from the past. And it was this feeling, deep and piercing, that remained with him as they left, abandoning him to the ranch that was no longer his. And in that solitude, he finally felt truly free. Silas watched as the wagon carrying the three sisters and the bound bandits slowly disappeared down the dusty road. The silence on the ranch was deafening. He stood alone, but in this silence, there was no longer the old loneliness. There was only a feeling of sadness and liberation. He had lost everything, but in return, he had gained something far more valuable. He had found himself. Cal and Jed approached him. "Boss, what should we do with these men?" Cal asked, gesturing to the bandits. "Take them to the sheriff in town," Silas said. "Tell him they attempted to rob the ranch. And then go home. I'm staying here alone." The cowboys exchanged surprised glances. "But what about you? Without cattle, without a home," Jed began. "It's all right," Silas replied, without a trace of bitterness in his voice. "This is no longer my home, and that's as it should be." Without a word, the cowboys loaded the bandits onto the wagon and left. Silas remained alone, and for the first time in many years, he felt a sense of peace. He sat on the porch and watched the sunset. The red sun slowly dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues. It felt like the final act of a grand yet cruel play. In his life, he had endured two great losses. The first was when he lost his wife and child. He had responded by closing off his heart, by retreating from the world. The second loss seemed far more brutal. He had lost everything he had, betrayed by those he had trusted. But this loss, paradoxically, brought him a profound clarity. He realized that his grief and loneliness had blinded him, making him willing to believe in any illusion of happiness. He had craved love and warmth so desperately that he had failed to see the obvious signs of deception. He recalled Eleanor's smile, her determination, which was actually a thirst for revenge. He remembered Mina's tenderness, which had ultimately been an attempt to soften his heart and make him more vulnerable. He recalled Corinne's mystery, which, as it turned out, was the only one of them who had struggled with her conscience, trying to prevent the inevitable. All of these qualities he had admired were merely parts of their elaborate disguise, and this disguise, along with his hopes, was now shattered. What remained was a complete, piercing sadness, the realization that the happiness he had experienced was a lie. But this sadness was also a form of healing. It offered him the chance to start over, free from the burden of the past. His house, his land, his life, all of it seemed to have vanished. But what remained was his heart, which, having endured a second devastating blow, had only become stronger and wiser. He was no longer susceptible to illusions because he had learned their true nature. He rose, surveyed the deserted ranch, and turned toward the empty expanses of the prairies. He didn't know where he would go or what he would do next, but he knew that he was free. Free from his past, from his grief, and from his naivety. This conclusion was not a triumph, it was an act of acceptance. The acceptance that life is not always what it seems. The acceptance that even the most beautiful illusions can be the cruelest, and that after their collapse, one can find a true, albeit sometimes bitter, freedom. This story, which appears to be about the Wild West and revenge, in fact, delves deeply into feelings familiar to every person, especially those who have lived a long life. It contains an essential lesson. What seems ideal to us is not always so in reality. Sometimes people who bring light into our lives have their own dark motives. They may use our vulnerabilities, our longing for the past, to achieve their goals. Life is not always a fairy tale where a beautiful woman saves the hero. This story is a testament to the importance of remaining vigilant, of seeing people for who they truly are, and not who we want them to be. This lesson is particularly relevant for the elderly, who are often targeted by deception and fraud. It is crucial to learn to accept ourselves and our past, rather than seeking false salvation in the promises of others. True strength is not found in possessing great wealth or a ranch, but in finding inner peace and freedom, even after the most devastating losses. True happiness is not a beautiful illusion, but the capacity to accept reality, no matter how bitter, and to move forward, knowing that your soul is finally free.